Under the quiet amber glow of the streetlights, the city of Queens in the early 1980s hums like a restless heartbeat. Cars crawl through the narrow streets, their tires whispering across wet asphalt. Storefronts are shuttered, but life still moves in the shadows, deals made in silence, promises whispered under the cover of smoke. Amid this nocturnal rhythm stands a figure both feared and respected. A thick gold chain catches the light as he steps out of a black Lincoln, his fur coat brushing the pavement. His name is Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols, and in the underworld of New York, his name carries weight, the kind that bends loyalty, fear, and greed into submission. They call him Fat Cat, not merely for his broad frame and heavy neck, but for what he represents, a man who feeds on the streets, who always lands on his feet, no matter how high the fall. In this city where survival is a full-time occupation, he has become something more than a hustler. He is a businessman in a world where product and death share the same shelf space. To some, he is a provider, giving opportunities in neighborhoods forgotten by politicians. To others, he is a poisoner of souls, a man whose empire is built on the suffering of addicts. The truth, like the city itself, lies somewhere in the mist between light and shadow. The calm voice of the narrator describes him not as a monster, but as a product of his environment. The 1970s and 80s in Queens were a storm, jobs disappearing, drugs flooding in, the young men of broken homes searching for power in a world that offered none. Out of this chaos, Fat Cat learned early that money was the only language anyone respected. Every dollar was a shield, every favor a weapon. He carried himself like a man who understood both the streets and human nature, quiet, calculating, never wasting words. Those who knew him said he had a presence, the kind of gravity that made a room quieter when he entered it. But tonight, as we begin his story, the streets are silent. The only sounds are the faint echo of distant sirens and the rhythmic tap of his shoes on the sidewalk. The city sleeps, but he doesn't. His empire runs 24 hours a day. Somewhere nearby, young men count cash behind tinted windows, while others cut and package the night's product under bare light bulbs. Every corner, every block, answers to him. He is both present and invisible, the architect of an underground economy that sustains thousands and destroys just as many. Still, in his solitude, there's a question, one that hums beneath the calm of his exterior. How did it all begin? How does a child from Alabama rise to become a kingpin ruling one of the most profitable drug territories in New York? What choices, what betrayals, what dreams lead a man to the point where his name alone can silence a room? As we pull back the curtain on his life, we'll see a story that's as much about the system as it is about one man's ambition. The rise of Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols is not just a tale of crime, it's a reflection of an era that built him, rewarded him, and eventually destroyed him. In the soft darkness, he looks out over the street that made him rich. Streetlights flicker on cracked pavement, illuminating the ghosts of hustlers who came before him. The camera of memory pans slowly, past old brownstones, graffiti-tagged walls, corner stores that double as lookout points. The city seems to breathe around him. And somewhere in that rhythm, a quiet warning lingers: every empire built on the streets has an expiration date. But for now, Fat Cat is untouchable. His cars are bulletproof, his money untraceable, his crew loyal. His legend is still growing, and the law hasn't yet found a way to reach him. People speak his name with a strange mix of fear and admiration, as if he's both a curse and a savior. They say he provides jobs, that he protects his neighborhood, that he punishes those who prey on his people. But the truth, the real truth, is buried beneath the allure of power and the glamour of survival. As this story begins, we invite you to settle in, to drift with the rhythm of the streets, to listen as the calm voice unfolds the layers of one man's journey from obscurity to infamy. Imagine the flicker of neon lights against wet concrete, the hush of late-night conversations, the pulse of a city that never really sleeps. This is the world of Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols, a world built on deals, loyalty, betrayal, and fate. What happened next would not only define his life, but also change the story of New York's underworld forever. The story of Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols begins far from the streets of New York, in the small industrial town of Bessemer, Alabama, where the air was thick with the scent of steel and red clay. He was born on Christmas Day, 1958, into a world that promised little but struggle. The South was still marked by deep poverty and quiet segregation, a place where opportunity came slow and life felt heavy. The nights were long, the days predictable. For many families like the Nichols, hope was something they whispered about, not something they lived. In the warmth of his childhood home, Lorenzo's mother did her best to keep food on the table and discipline in the air. His father, often working multiple jobs, taught him early that the world didn't owe anyone kindness. Yet beneath the routine of chores and church, the boy's eyes were already fixed on something else, a restlessness, a hunger for more than what his small town could ever give. He'd watch the freight trains passing through, carrying goods northward, and wonder where they were headed. To him, those trains were escape routes, silver veins leading out of confinement and into something bigger. When his family moved to Queens, New York, in the late 1960s, Lorenzo was barely a teenager. The move was meant to be a new beginning, a chance to start fresh in the land of skyscrapers and noise. But the city he found was not the dream the family imagined. New York was alive, yes, but it was also ruthless. The streets were crowded with ambition and desperation. There were no front porches, no soft sunsets, only apartment windows glowing like stars above cracked sidewalks. For a kid who had known simplicity, the city was overwhelming, a concrete storm filled with noise, hustlers, and unseen rules. Queens in the 1970s was a mosaic of life. Immigrant families from the Caribbean, African Americans from the South, Latinos, Italians, all chasing survival in their own way. The sound of boom boxes mixed with the echo of subway brakes. The city pulsed like a living organism, and Lorenzo absorbed it all. He learned the rhythm of the blocks, the slang, the hustle. He could see how some men made their living not from offices or factories, but from what happened in alleys and behind closed doors. These men had money, respect, and fear, three things Lorenzo would come to understand intimately. At school, he was quiet but sharp. Teachers saw potential, though he rarely stayed still long enough for anyone to guide him. He wasn't drawn to books, he was drawn to motion, to energy, to the magnetic pull of the streets. The local basketball courts became his classroom, the older hustlers his professors. He studied their movements, how they talked, how they dressed, how they commanded space. It wasn't the violence that attracted him, it was the control. Even as a boy, he could sense that control was the most valuable currency in his neighborhood. By his late teens, Lorenzo's family was struggling like many others. Rent was high, work was scarce, and temptation lingered at every corner. The streets of Jamaica, Queens, offered fast money, money that could buy sneakers, cars, respect. And in a place where respect often meant safety, that kind of currency was irresistible. He started small, running errands, learning who to trust and who to avoid. He wasn't loud or reckless. He was patient, observant. The kind of kid who waited his turn and remembered every lesson. But New York was not kind to dreamers. The 1970s saw the city collapsing under economic strain, unemployment, and an escalating drug crisis. Entire neighborhoods fell into decay. Abandoned buildings became meeting points for deals, and children grew up watching the line between right and wrong blur into a haze of survival. Lorenzo saw that the system didn't protect people like him. It ignored them. And so he began to believe that the only way to rise was to make his own system, one where the rules bent in his favor. It was around this time that the nickname began to surface, Cat. It wasn't yet Fat Cat, but just Cat, a nod to his cool demeanor and ability to always land on his feet. He had a way of slipping out of trouble, of avoiding traps both on the streets and in conversations. The name stuck because it fit. He wasn't the biggest or the loudest, but he was steady, cunning, always a step ahead. That reputation would grow with him, shaping the legend that followed. His early experiences in Queens carved a blueprint in his mind, a belief that power wasn't about brute force, but about information, timing, and presence. He learned to read people the way others read books. He could tell when someone was lying, when someone was desperate, when someone could be used. This intuitive skill became his greatest weapon. In a world full of noise, he listened. In a city full of movement, he waited. And in a place that worshipped the fast life, he played the long game. Still, behind the ambition was something human, the boy from Alabama who wanted to prove himself, who wanted to give his mother a life free from worry. That duality, the mix of love and hunger, shaped his path. It made him both relatable and dangerous. Every choice he made from here on would blur the line between necessity and greed. As the years passed, Queens hardened him. The laughter of his childhood was replaced by the low hum of risk and reward. The lessons from home, honesty, faith, patience, faded beneath the city's louder truths: never show weakness, always pay back loyalty, and if someone crosses you, make sure they never do it again. Lorenzo didn't just learn these rules, he embodied them. And as the decade turned, he began to understand something profound: power wasn't given in his world, it was taken. Quietly, strategically, and without apology. He wasn't yet the fat cat that newspapers would one day write about. But the foundation had been set. The boy who left Alabama in search of opportunity had found it, not in boardrooms or classrooms, but in the invisible corridors of the streets. In the distance, a siren wails, a sound that will soon become the background music of his life. The young man who once dreamed of escape has now found a new kind of captivity, one disguised as freedom. The city has claimed him, molded him, and soon, it will crown him. But as with all crowns forged in darkness, the weight will come later. The streets have a way of testing loyalty, not through words, but through survival. By the time Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols entered his late teens, he already knew that every man in Jamaica, Queens had a story, and most of them ended with either a cell, a coffin, or a cold silence. But he wasn't afraid of that. In his mind, those were the fates of the careless, the ones who talked too much, trusted too easily, or moved too fast. Lorenzo was different. He studied mistakes the way others studied success. And soon, that patience would turn him from a neighborhood kid into a name the streets whispered about. It started small: petty hustles, quick grabs, schemes that barely made enough to fill a pocket. But for Lorenzo, every move was practice. He was learning how people reacted under pressure, how the cops moved, how to spot the eyes of an informant in a crowd. In those early years, he wasn't chasing riches, he was collecting data. The streets were his classroom, and every arrest, every rumor, every close call was a lesson in the art of staying alive. By 1976, his lessons caught up to him. He was convicted of 2 robberies, sentenced to 18 years, though he would serve less than 3. The details of the crimes have faded into the larger legend of his life, but the truth remains, that prison was the first time the world forced him to stop. It was his first taste of confinement, of walls that didn't bend to his will. Inside, he was no longer the quiet observer on the block. He was inmate number, a man stripped of name and identity. But even behind bars, he adapted. Prison was its own economy, and he learned quickly that influence could exist anywhere. He watched how things moved inside, the barter of cigarettes, the hierarchy among inmates, the way respect was both currency and armor. He didn't fight for dominance, he earned it through calculation. He knew when to speak, when to listen, when to let silence do the work. Men twice his size deferred to him, not because of fear, but because he seemed to see through them. At night, lying on a thin mattress, he thought about the streets he'd left behind, the flashing lights, the smell of fried food from the corner store, the laughter of hustlers counting cash. He missed the rhythm of it, the unpredictability. Prison had rhythm too, but it was a slower, more punishing beat. It forced reflection. It made him realize that freedom wasn't just about walking outside, it was about control. And he swore that when he got out, he'd never let anyone, not even the law, control him again. He spent those years observing men who'd lost everything, killers, dealers, thieves, all of them broken in different ways. Some boasted about their crimes like war heroes, others sat in silence, haunted by ghosts. Lorenzo never judged them. He listened. He took note of what led them there. The common thread was always the same: arrogance. They thought they were untouchable. They trusted too much. They didn't plan for betrayal. By the time his release date came in 1980, he had built a philosophy that would define his empire: stay low, stay smart, and never underestimate desperation. When he walked out of prison, the air felt different. The city had changed while he was gone. Crack was beginning to creep into neighborhoods, replacing heroin as the new epidemic. The cops were more aggressive. The violence sharper. But Lorenzo was sharper too. The world outside had been waiting, and he returned to it with eyes that saw differently now. He wasn't just a street hustler anymore, he was a strategist. He'd spent years in the shadows, studying power in its purest form, the kind born from necessity and fear. He went back to the same corners that raised him, but this time he didn't move like a hungry kid. He moved like a man who tasted loss and wanted control over his own fate. He connected with old acquaintances, many of whom were now running small crews. Some welcomed him back with open arms, others saw him as competition. But Lorenzo never forced alliances. He made people come to him. He knew the secret of real power: people trust the man who seems like he doesn't need anything. Still, prison had hardened him in ways he didn't fully understand yet. There was a new coldness in him, a quiet edge that made others cautious. When he spoke, people listened. When he stayed silent, people wondered what he was thinking. In an environment where perception meant survival, that silence became his armor. Soon, his attention turned toward something bigger than quick hustles. He realized that stealing or robbing brought short-term gain and long-term risk. The real money, the sustainable kind, flowed through distribution, through product, organization, and discipline. He began to imagine the streets not as chaos but as a network, one that could be controlled, scaled, and managed like a corporation. He wanted to build something that lasted, something that didn't depend on luck or chance. But before the empire, there was still one lesson left to learn: that loyalty could break as easily as glass, and betrayal often came from the ones closest to you. Lorenzo began to see this truth when some of his early partners, men he'd once trusted, turned on each other for scraps. He watched greed devour friendship, and fear twist loyalty into survival instinct. He took note of every weakness he saw in them, not out of malice, but out of preparation. He understood now that his future depended on eliminating unpredictability, and unpredictability always came from emotion. There's a quiet moment to imagine: Lorenzo standing on a Queen Street corner in the early morning, the sky still gray, the city half asleep. He lights a cigarette, exhales slowly, and looks down the long stretch of 150th Street, the same road that will one day bear his empire. To anyone passing by, he's just another man getting by. But inside, he's already building blueprints, of routes, connections, and methods. He doesn't know it yet, but every step he takes from here will bring him closer to both wealth and ruin. His time behind bars had not broken him, it had refined him. Prison taught him patience. It taught him how to read people. It stripped him of everything and, in doing so, left only what mattered: the hunger to rise. He'd lost 3 years, but in his mind, he'd gained a lifetime of understanding. The streets would soon learn that the boy who went in was gone. In his place stood a man who saw the game for what it truly was, and who planned to play it better than anyone else. What he didn't know was that this new clarity came with a curse. The more control he sought, the more he would have to sacrifice to keep it. The climb to power would give him everything he thought he wanted: money, loyalty, fear, but it would also bring a new kind of imprisonment. Not of walls, but of paranoia. Not of bars, but of consequence. For now, though, the city welcomes him back like a stage waiting for its actor. The audience doesn't yet know the script, but the opening act is ready to begin. Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols steps back into the world, not as a victim of circumstance, but as its architect. And somewhere deep in the rhythm of the streets, fate begins to move in his direction. By the early 1980s, the streets of Queens were changing, darker, hungrier, and more dangerous than ever before. The heroin that once moved quietly through the city's back alleys had become an industry. Addicts lined up in shadows, their eyes glassy, their hands trembling, trading what little they had for a moment's escape. The police presence thickened, but so did the money. For men like Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols, this was more than an opportunity, it was destiny calling. He had spent years observing from the edges, studying every pattern, every weakness in the existing drug trade. Now, finally free and sharpened by his time inside, he began laying the foundation for what would soon become one of the most organized and lucrative heroin networks in Baltimore and beyond. But he didn't rush. Fat Cat understood something that most street hustlers never did: power wasn't built overnight, it was cultivated, layer by layer, connection by connection. He started small, setting up reliable supply lines from New York to Baltimore. He made sure every move was silent, every hand that touched the product was loyal and disciplined. He treated the operation not as a gang but as a business. Every corner boy had a purpose, every street runner was accountable. He was meticulous, almost corporate in his approach. He created systems for counting, storing, and distributing. His lieutenants were men who had proven themselves through loyalty, not fear. Fat Cat wasn't a man who ruled through violence, not yet. He ruled through structure. At first, he kept things local, testing how the market responded, how law enforcement moved, how word spread. But success came fast. Too fast. Within a few months, his name began to circulate again, quietly at first, in the whispers of dealers and addicts who knew where the best product came from. Then louder, in the backrooms of bars and pool halls where hustlers gathered to compare numbers. They called him, the man with the golden line, the one whose heroin was so pure it barely needed to be cut. Baltimore had seen plenty of pushers, but Lorenzo's operation felt different. His people weren't sloppy or flashy. They didn't attract unnecessary attention. They worked like professionals, like soldiers. And at the center of it all was Fat Cat, calm, calculating, with an aura that made even his enemies respect him. He rarely raised his voice, but when he spoke, people listened. He had a way of making his orders sound like suggestions, but everyone knew better than to disobey. Still, Fat Cat knew that purity and organization alone weren't enough. The real key to longevity was control over territory, control over supply, and most importantly, control over people. He built loyalty the way a craftsman builds a house, brick by brick. He made sure his crew was paid well, that their families were looked after, that loyalty had tangible rewards. He'd say, if you keep your people fed, they'll never bite the hand that feeds them. It was simple wisdom, but it worked. He also understood the value of perception. He dressed well, carried himself with quiet confidence, and never bragged about money. He didn't need to. His reputation did the talking. In an era where many street bosses flaunted their wealth with cars and jewelry, Fat Cat remained understated. It made him harder to trace, harder to envy, harder to target. In the shadows, understatement was power. But power attracts attention, and not always the kind you want. The more money he made, the more the city's existing players started to take notice. There were whispers, resentments, and unspoken challenges. Some of the older dealers didn't like that a young ex-con was suddenly running things with precision they'd never seen before. They thought they could intimidate him, pressure him, maybe even push him out. But Fat Cat was never one for confrontation unless it was necessary. When tested, he responded not with emotion, but with strategy. His approach to conflict was surgical. If someone crossed him, they didn't just disappear, their business did. Their suppliers dried up, their customers vanished, and suddenly they found themselves alone. Fat Cat didn't need to kill to win, he knew how to starve an opponent until they folded. It was power through pressure, not panic. And it gave him a mystique that violence alone could never achieve. Still, there were moments when the calm broke. In a business that dirty, violence was inevitable. Betrayals happened. Crews turned greedy. And when they did, Fat Cat's response was swift and precise. He made examples of those who crossed him, not for cruelty, but for order. The streets were watching, and he knew that fear was a language every hustler understood. Baltimore, by this time, had become a chessboard of power and money. Police units were overwhelmed by the sudden wave of drug-related crime, and the city's political machinery struggled to keep up. Amidst that chaos, Fat Cat's empire thrived. His heroin was flooding the city, feeding an addiction that seemed unstoppable. The profits were staggering. Every night, money counted in backrooms, wrapped tight in rubber bands, filled duffel bags that disappeared into cars with tinted windows. What separated Fat Cat from others was his ability to stay emotionally detached. Where others saw power as glory, he saw it as responsibility. He was building something, an empire that ran with efficiency, discipline, and silence. He often told his men, "Noise brings heat. Quiet brings peace." That mantra defined his rule. His lieutenants operated under strict codes, enforcing respect and order with minimal chaos. Yet, in the stillness of power, there's always the first whisper of paranoia. Fat Cat could feel it, that subtle tension that came when everything was going too well. He began sleeping less, thinking more. He watched his people closely. He noticed small things, a conversation that ended when he entered a room, a glance that lingered too long, a runner who came up short one night. The empire was growing, but so was the pressure to maintain it. Every night, as the city hummed outside his window, he'd count his money and think about control, how fragile it was, how easily it could slip through his fingers. He wasn't just playing the game anymore, he was shaping it. But shaping something that dangerous always came with risk. And somewhere in that growing empire, in the flow of cash, loyalty, and silence, a storm was beginning to form. A storm that would test everything he had built, and force him to choose between empire and self-preservation. For now, though, Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols stood at the top of his game, unchallenged, unseen, untouchable. The city belonged to him. The streets whispered his name. And though the night seemed peaceful, the seeds of betrayal were already taking root beneath his feet. Power has a strange gravity. The higher a man rises, the more people begin to orbit around him, some drawn by admiration, others by greed. By the mid-1980s, Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols had turned his quiet empire into a living organism. Every corner of Baltimore seemed to hum with his influence. Money flowed like a current through the city's veins, and he was the pulse keeping it alive. But as his network expanded, so did the cast of characters who wanted in, friends, rivals, partners, and parasites alike. Fat Cat knew that an empire built on loyalty needed structure. He had lieutenants, runners, and enforcers, each with a defined role. His right-hand man, Tony Rivers, was the calm voice of reason in a world of chaos. Tony had been with him since the early days, running corners and collecting dues when Fat Cat was still building his foundation. He was disciplined, business-minded, and fiercely loyal, the kind of man who understood Fat Cat's vision without needing it explained. To the outside world, Tony was just another soldier. To Fat Cat, he was the stabilizing force that kept the machine running smoothly. But loyalty has a shelf life in the underworld, and as the money multiplied, so did temptation. Every man in Fat Cat's circle had ambitions, dreams of control, of wealth, of respect. Fat Cat had created a system where men could thrive, but that system also bred envy. Some wanted more than what they were given, and in a game where greed moved faster than gratitude, cracks began to form. Fat Cat had rules, unwritten, but sacred. No stealing from the organization. No unnecessary violence that brought attention. No betrayal. He kept order through discipline, not chaos. But Baltimore's streets were unpredictable. Rival crews began to surface, some backed by New York suppliers who didn't like Fat Cat's dominance. The air grew tense, every block a silent battlefield of territory and respect. It was around this time that Fat Cat's operation became truly corporate. He implemented hierarchy, runners reported to captains, captains to lieutenants, lieutenants to him. Money was collected and cleaned through legitimate fronts, auto shops, bars, even small real estate ventures. Everything moved with precision. He'd often tell his crew, if the feds ever come, they'll need a roadmap to find me. And for a while, it seemed true. The heroin itself came from sources most couldn't touch, pure, high-grade, shipped indiscreetly through intermediaries who never knew who they were truly working for. Fat Cat had mastered the art of invisibility. He wasn't on the corners. He wasn't making handoffs. He stayed in the background, orchestrating the movements of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people without leaving fingerprints. He began to live better, not lavishly, but comfortably. A modest home tucked away from chaos, a few cars, quiet dinners with close friends. To anyone outside the life, he seemed like a small businessman. No flash, no entourage, no noise. But behind that calm exterior was a man who knew exactly how fragile peace could be. There's an image that captures this phase of his life: Fat Cat sitting in a dimly lit backroom, money stacked on the table in neat bundles, Tony beside him checking ledgers by hand. A small radio plays softly in the background. Outside, the city is loud, sirens, laughter, the buzz of night. Inside, everything is still. Fat Cat smokes a cigarette, staring at the bills, lost in thought. It isn't greed that drives him, it's control. The order. The system. For a man who once had nothing, the structure itself is intoxicating. But power never stays quiet for long. Law enforcement was beginning to take notice. Detectives in Baltimore and New York started tracing patterns, similar packaging, similar purity, similar street names whispered in interrogation rooms. The DEA began to connect dots between crews that supposedly had no relation. Slowly, the invisible threads that tied Fat Cat's network together began to glow under federal light. Still, inside the empire, things appeared stable. Fat Cat continued expanding into new neighborhoods, making alliances with smaller crews who preferred protection over independence. He was careful about who he trusted. Every deal went through intermediaries, no one met him directly unless absolutely necessary. He had learned from others' mistakes, from men who got too comfortable, too visible. He told Tony once, "The second they know your name, you've already lost half the game." Despite his caution, however, the growth brought new problems. Success attracts greed, and greed breeds betrayal. Some of his lower captains began skimming off the top, pocketing extra profits, thinking the boss would never notice. Fat Cat noticed everything. He didn't confront them immediately, he let them dig their own graves. To him, patience was punishment. And when the time came, he dealt with it not through rage, but through message. One evening, 2 of the men caught stealing were found beaten and left outside a corner store, alive, but barely. No one said who did it. No one had to. Word spread quickly. It was a reminder that even in silence, Fat Cat was always watching. These calculated moves built his legend. The name, Fat Cat, became more than a nickname, it became a warning. To the streets, he represented balance, ruthless when necessary, but fair when respected. Addicts feared him. Dealers admired him. Cops couldn't touch him. He existed somewhere between myth and man, like a shadow the city couldn't pin down. But in the quiet moments, when the streets finally slept, he'd lie awake with a thought that haunted him: control only lasts as long as people believe in it. He knew one mistake, one weak link, could unravel everything. He could control supply, loyalty, and fear, but not time. And time was always watching, waiting to remind every king that empires, no matter how solid, eventually crumble. As the 1980s wore on, the heroin business grew deadlier. More arrests. More violence. More pressure. Fat Cat's machine was still running smoothly, but the noise outside was getting louder. Federal agencies were stepping up surveillance. Informants were quietly flipping. The air was shifting, and even Fat Cat could sense it. The question wasn't if the storm was coming, it was when. For now, though, he remained the king in the shadows, the quiet architect of an empire built on discipline, silence, and fear. The streets were his kingdom, the night his disguise. And though cracks were forming beneath the surface, Fat Cat still believed he could hold it all together, unaware that the very order he built to protect himself would soon become the cage that trapped him. By 1985, the empire Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols had built was no longer a secret whispered among street corners, it was a force that defined Baltimore's underworld. The city pulsed under his network's rhythm, the dealers, the runners, the stash houses, and the endless stream of cash that moved with mechanical precision. But with power came a kind of visibility he had always feared. For the first time, eyes he couldn't control began watching, federal eyes. And beneath that calm exterior, Fat Cat could feel the temperature rising. The first sign came quietly, almost invisibly. A cousin of one of his lieutenants was picked up for a small possession charge. Normally, that would have been nothing, a few nights in a cell, a fine, and back to work. But this time, the man didn't come back. Word spread that he'd been talking to federal agents. Not the local police, feds. The letters DEA, once distant and abstract, now hovered in every whispered conversation. Fat Cat didn't panic. He knew fear spread faster than truth, and he wouldn't let his people see him shaken. Instead, he did what he always did, he studied. He began moving differently. Phone calls were shorter. Meetings were quieter. Stash houses were shifted. Trucks changed routes. If the feds wanted to trace him, he'd make them chase ghosts. He had survived this long by staying invisible, and invisibility was an art. He never touched the product. Never signed papers. Never appeared at deals. Money passed through layers of hands before reaching him, and by the time it did, it was clean, quiet, and untraceable. To the government, he was just another face in the city, calm, polite, unremarkable. But deep down, Fat Cat understood something the younger men in his organization didn't: no empire lasts forever. The law was patient. They didn't need to move fast, they only needed one mistake. And that mistake usually came from within. It was during this time that Fat Cat's paranoia began to grow, not the loud kind that drives a man to madness, but the quiet, creeping kind that makes him second-guess every glance, every word, every silence. He trusted only a handful of people: Tony Rivers, his old friend and right hand, and a few lieutenants who had proven loyalty through blood and time. Everyone else, no matter how close, was watched. The DEA, meanwhile, was closing in. They had begun to understand the scale of what Fat Cat had built. Agents followed low-level dealers, tapped phones, tracked vehicles. They pieced together a map of transactions, names, and drop points, a web that all pointed to a man they couldn't yet touch. They called him the Ghost of Baltimore, the one whose name never appeared on paper but whose fingerprints were everywhere. Fat Cat, however, had a different perspective. To him, the DEA was just another competitor, one that could be managed like any other threat. He didn't underestimate them, but he didn't overestimate them either. He believed in control, and as long as he controlled his people, he believed no one could touch him. Still, the tension was real. He started holding meetings in unusual places, empty warehouses, basements, even parks late at night. Conversations were coded, names never used. He created new systems of communication, handwritten notes passed through trusted couriers, never phones. He had seen too many bosses fall because they loved the sound of their own voice on a wiretap. To outsiders, Fat Cat seemed untouchable. To those inside, he seemed invincible. But inside his own head, the walls were closing in. He began to notice how the city was changing, more arrests, more headlines, more attention. Baltimore was burning under the weight of drugs and violence, and politicians were under pressure to show results. That meant one thing: the government would come for whoever they could find at the top. And while Fat Cat had done everything to stay unseen, even shadows leave trails. His lieutenants, the ones managing distribution and collection, were starting to live large: cars, jewelry, women. That kind of noise drew attention. He scolded them privately, warning them to stay low, to keep quiet. But greed is louder than wisdom, and slowly, his organization began to glow on the federal radar. There's a story, half rumor, half truth, about one night when Fat Cat sat alone in his apartment, lights off, curtains drawn. The city glowed outside his window, sirens echoing faintly in the distance. He poured himself a drink and stared at the glass. For a moment, he thought about what he had built: the money, the respect, the empire. And then he thought about the faces of the men who'd fallen before him, powerful, feared, and gone. He whispered to himself, "They never last, do they?" He knew he was living on borrowed time. Every empire has its expiration date, and his was written in invisible ink, somewhere in the files of a federal office, waiting to be uncovered. Despite that knowledge, he didn't slow down. If anything, he became more methodical. He refined operations, cut unnecessary ties, rotated personnel to confuse investigators. He turned the empire into a moving target, impossible to pin down. Every week, routes changed. Every month, contacts replaced. It was control through chaos, his way of staying alive. But paranoia is like a shadow: the more you run from it, the larger it grows. He began questioning everyone, even Tony. Was Tony too close to certain people? Was he meeting agents? The thoughts weren't based on evidence, just instincts, but in Fat Cat's world, instincts kept you breathing. At the same time, he began noticing the strain in his crew. The constant changes, the mistrust, the pressure, it was eating at them. Some whispered that Fat Cat was losing his mind, that he'd become too paranoid to lead effectively. But no one dared say it to his face. They knew what happened to men who disrespected him. Law enforcement was patient, almost surgical. They didn't move on whispers, they waited for proof. And eventually, they found it. One of Fat Cat's distributors got caught with product, enough to guarantee a long sentence. But instead of taking the fall, he talked. He didn't give up the full picture, but he gave enough to confirm what the DEA suspected: a man named Lorenzo Nichols was pulling the strings. From that moment, the clock began ticking. Every move he made, every phone call, every delivery, all of it was being watched. The hunters were closing in, even if the prey hadn't realized it yet. And still, Fat Cat kept working. Because in his mind, to stop was to surrender. He'd built his entire life around control, and the thought of losing it, to the streets, to the feds, to time, was unbearable. The empire was his identity, his purpose, his reason. Late one night, Tony warned him. "They're coming, Cat. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon." Fat Cat just smiled, the kind of quiet smile only men who've already made peace with their fate can manage. "Then let them come," he said softly. "They still gotta find me first." Outside, Baltimore didn't sleep. The streets kept humming, the money kept flowing, and the empire kept turning, unaware that the beginning of the end had already arrived. By late 1985, Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols was living two lives: the calm, composed businessman on the surface, and the paranoid kingpin beneath it. His operation had grown beyond what he ever imagined. Heroin flowed from New York to Baltimore with mathematical precision, and money flooded back in waves. But the higher he climbed, the thinner the air became. Each decision carried weight, each move drew more attention. He had built his kingdom out of silence, but the world around him was getting louder. Fat Cat's days followed a ritual. He rose early, before sunrise, to the sound of the city stirring awake, distant traffic, a dog barking, the hum of life outside. He liked those moments of calm, when the world hadn't yet started demanding things from him. Over coffee, he'd review ledgers, cash reports, and coded notes from his lieutenants. To anyone else, it looked like the morning routine of a small business owner. But those papers were the veins of a multi-million-dollar operation. Every day, he balanced contradictions. The money demanded expansion, but expansion brought risk. The people demanded trust, but trust invited betrayal. It was a delicate game, one that required both steel and subtlety. He moved with quiet confidence, but behind his steady eyes, the gears never stopped turning. He knew something was shifting, something beyond his control. The DEA's pressure was no longer invisible. There were strange cars parked for too long near certain corners. Unfamiliar faces hanging around bars that once felt safe. Some of his runners were getting picked up more often, questioned longer, and released faster. Fat Cat didn't believe in coincidence. He knew what that meant, informants. He started trimming the fat. Anyone who couldn't be trusted was quietly phased out. He'd rather lose manpower than lose control. Some of his men disappeared voluntarily, sensing the heat. Others, less fortunate, disappeared for good. Every cut tightened the circle, every disappearance fed the whispers, Fat Cat's losing it. He's turning on his own. But it wasn't madness, it was mathematics. He was calculating risk, reducing exposure. It was survival. At night, when the city glowed beneath streetlights and the smell of diesel hung in the air, Fat Cat and Tony Rivers met in a small, dimly lit apartment, their unofficial headquarters. They'd sit across from each other at a wooden table, old maps and ledger books spread between them. Cigarette smoke coiled into the air. "They're building something, Cat," Tony said one night, his tone low, cautious. "I can feel it. Every arrest, every question, it's like they're trying to box us in." Fat Cat nodded slowly. "Then we don't give them a shape to box. We move everything. No patterns, no faces, no names." He wasn't afraid. Fat Cat rarely showed fear. But beneath the calm, he could feel the weight of the empire pressing on his chest. It was no longer just about money, it was about staying alive, staying free. He'd spent years building control, but now that control had become a burden. Every ounce of power came with a pound of paranoia. He began traveling between Baltimore and New York more frequently, shifting operations, double-checking connections, personally inspecting stash houses. His lieutenants noticed the change. The once distant boss was now hands-on again, watchful, cautious, relentless. To them, it was proof of dedication. To him, it was desperation masked as discipline. Meanwhile, the streets were changing faster than anyone expected. Crack cocaine was flooding in, shifting demand, altering the balance of power. Younger dealers, reckless and hungry, were taking risks Fat Cat never would. The chaos made his operation seem almost old-fashioned, structured, methodical, patient. And yet, it was that discipline that kept him alive while others burned out. Still, he could sense the shift in tone among his men. The younger ones wanted faster money, bigger cuts. They didn't understand why Fat Cat was slowing down, tightening rules, enforcing silence. To them, the old man was losing his edge. To Fat Cat, they were losing their minds. The tension grew quietly, like a hairline crack in glass. One wrong move, one bad decision, and everything could shatter. Around this time, Fat Cat started keeping distance from everyone, even Tony. He'd go days without contact, preferring to move through the city alone. He stopped using his main car, switched routes daily, and used different payphones for each call. His paranoia had evolved into procedure. There's a haunting image from that period: Fat Cat sitting alone in a parked car under a flickering streetlight, watching rain slide down the windshield. He isn't meeting anyone. He isn't running from anyone. He's just watching, waiting, thinking, planning. The city feels heavier at night now, every sound sharper, every silence deeper. He lights a cigarette and whispers to himself, "Ain't no loyalty left out here anymore." He wasn't wrong. The DEA task force had grown. What began as a small investigation into street-level heroin was now a coordinated federal effort involving wiretaps, undercover agents, and surveillance. They were patient, methodical, and ruthless. They didn't want the runners, they wanted the man pulling the strings. And with every arrest, every flipped dealer, the circle around Fat Cat tightened. Still, he kept moving. He told his men, "As long as I breathe, the streets stay fed." To them, that meant confidence. To him, it meant duty, a promise to the only world that ever gave him purpose. But the truth was beginning to surface: the empire was too big to hide, too heavy to carry. His once perfect structure was showing cracks, small at first, but spreading. A stash house raided here. A courier missing there. Each hit was a reminder that control, no matter how carefully built, was temporary. Tony, always the loyal soldier, tried to reason with him. "Maybe it's time to step back, Cat. Let someone else take the heat. You got enough to disappear." Fat Cat smiled faintly, eyes distant. "And go where, Tony? The streets know my name. The money knows my hands. There ain't no leaving this game. You just play till the end." He wasn't being dramatic. He was being honest. Men like him didn't retire. They either faded quietly or fell loudly. The tension that defined this era of Fat Cat's life wasn't just external, it was psychological. Every decision carried weight. Every silence felt like a countdown. He was fighting two enemies, the DEA outside, and the doubt inside. And in that fight, sleep became rare, peace became impossible. The empire still stood, money still flowed, and the streets still whispered his name. But in the quiet moments between strategy and survival, Fat Cat knew what was coming. Empires don't fall overnight, they erode from within. And while the world around him still bowed to his power, the man inside was beginning to feel something he hadn't felt since his first prison sentence: inevitability. By the summer of 1986, the cracks that Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols had tried so hard to seal were beginning to split wide open. The city that once bowed to his quiet rule was now changing faster than he could adapt. Baltimore's underworld was becoming louder, bolder, and far more dangerous than before. The heroin trade, once a disciplined and organized business under his control, was now a battlefield of ego, greed, and betrayal. The streets whispered rumors that Fat Cat's empire was slipping, that the king was losing his crown. Most of those whispers came from men who had eaten from his hand, who now saw opportunity in his struggle. To the untrained eye, his operation still looked intact, still profitable. The money was coming in. The cars were still moving. But Fat Cat knew the truth: control was an illusion that needed constant maintenance, and lately, the illusion was fading. He'd built his world on loyalty, but loyalty is only as strong as the fear that holds it. The younger generation didn't fear Fat Cat the way the old guard did. They respected his legend, yes, the man who had turned Baltimore's drug scene into a business. But they wanted their own story now. They wanted fast money, faster fame. They didn't care about quiet discipline or clean systems. They wanted to be seen. And that visibility, that hunger for spotlight, was poison. Crack cocaine had arrived in Baltimore like a storm. It was cheap, addictive, and devastatingly profitable. Dealers who once moved heroin in small, careful doses were now flooding neighborhoods with crack rocks that sold faster than anyone could count. Fat Cat saw the wave coming early and hated it. Crack brought chaos. It brought noise. It brought the kind of heat that heroin dealers avoided for decades. He refused to get involved at first. "Crack's a bomb," he told Tony Rivers one night, pacing his apartment floor. "You light it, you can't control the blast." Tony, ever pragmatic, shrugged. "If we don't, someone else will. Streets don't wait, Cat." Fat Cat stopped pacing, turned, and stared at him. "Then let the fools burn first." But watching others profit while his market shrank gnawed at him. The streets were changing without his permission. The same corners that once carried his product were now under the control of new, reckless faces, kids who had never paid dues, who didn't understand the rules. Violence spiked. Gunshots echoed at night like punctuation marks in a story spiraling out of control. For the first time, Fat Cat felt like a relic. His business model, built on precision, trust, and discipline, was becoming outdated. The chaos of the crack era didn't reward patience, it rewarded ruthlessness. The kind of men it birthed didn't care about alliances or codes. They cared only about survival, and headlines. And yet, he couldn't walk away. The money was still too good, the control too addictive. He doubled down on what he knew best: silence, secrecy, and structure. He began focusing more on his heroin trade again, keeping his product pure, his networks tight. He believed quality would always beat chaos. But even quality had its limits when the streets were bleeding faster than you could patch them. By mid-1986, law enforcement had ramped up their campaign. Baltimore was now one of the DEA's primary focus zones. Agents were swarming corners, raiding stash houses, flipping low-level dealers. Each arrest chipped away at the foundation of Fat Cat's world. His soldiers were more paranoid than ever, his lieutenants growing restless. The meetings grew tense. Tony noticed the change. Fat Cat, once calm and methodical, was becoming short-tempered. He questioned everyone, trusted no one. Sometimes, he would stop mid-conversation and stare off, lost in thought, as if replaying some invisible chess game in his head. One night, while sitting in the back of his Cadillac, Fat Cat received news that hit him harder than a raid ever could: one of his closest couriers had been arrested. Not just arrested, flipped. The feds had offered a deal, and the kid had taken it. His testimony could link Fat Cat directly to the movement of several major shipments. For a long moment, Fat Cat said nothing. The car was silent except for the sound of rain tapping against the window. Finally, he exhaled a slow breath. "That boy forgot who fed him," he said softly. Tony shifted uneasily. "What do you want to do about it?" Fat Cat's reply was simple. "Handle it." The next day, the courier was found dead in an alley, shot twice in the head. The message was clear: betrayal had a price. But instead of restoring order, it only deepened the fear. Even his loyal men began to wonder who would be next. Fat Cat didn't care. Fear was currency, and he was running out of time to spend it. He started isolating himself further. Calls were fewer. Meetings were shorter. He trusted only Tony and two old lieutenants who had been with him since the beginning. He rarely went out during the day, preferring the cover of night. His life had become a ghost routine, moving from one safe house to another, always with a gun under the seat and an exit plan in his head. And yet, there were moments, rare, fleeting, when the weight of it all caught up to him. Sometimes, he'd drive alone through the streets of Baltimore, past the corners where his empire began. He'd watch the kids slinging crack on the same stoops where he once dreamed of control. He'd see the addicts, hollow-eyed, desperate, stumbling in the shadows of his old product. It was like watching a reflection of his own decay. One night, he pulled over near an abandoned rowhouse, engine running, headlights dimmed. He sat there for minutes, maybe hours, staring into nothing. He thought about his mother, his old friends, the young version of himself who just wanted to be somebody. That boy was gone, buried beneath the weight of money and blood. He whispered to himself, "Ain't no kings in this game. Just survivors." But even that wasn't true anymore. Because the DEA wasn't chasing survivors, they were hunting ghosts. Unbeknownst to Fat Cat, the federal task force had just secured a key wiretap. His closest associates were being recorded. Every coded word, every transaction, every late-night conversation, catalogued and analyzed. The empire wasn't collapsing, it was being dismantled piece by piece, from the inside out. And while Fat Cat still believed he could outthink the system was already 2 steps ahead. The streets no longer belonged to him. The rules had changed. The silence that once protected him was now being used against him, every phone call, every whisper, every deal turned into evidence. He still walked with the same slow, confident stride. Still wore the same immaculate suits. Still looked like the man who ruled the Baltimore drug trade. But behind his calm exterior, the realization was sinking in, the game was over. He just didn't know it yet. By early 1987, the walls around Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols were closing in, not suddenly, but steadily, like a slow tightening of rope. Every day seemed to bring another sign that his empire was no longer his own. Streets he once ruled with silence now echoed with rumors, with gunshots, with whispers of federal surveillance. The calm discipline that had made him powerful was being tested by forces he couldn't control: betrayal, ambition, and the relentless march of law enforcement. It started small, as it always does. A car parked too long outside a known stash house. A phone line suddenly full of static. Familiar faces avoiding his gaze. Each detail might have meant nothing on its own, but together they painted a pattern Fat Cat couldn't ignore. Something invisible was crawling beneath the surface of his world, the kind of threat that doesn't announce itself until it's too late. And yet, even as the noose tightened, he refused to show fear. To his men, Fat Cat still projected calm authority. He still wore pressed suits, still moved with that measured, deliberate stride. His presence alone could silence a room. But inside, something was changing. For the first time, he felt small tremors of doubt, not about his control, but about the loyalty of the men who surrounded him. Tony Rivers, his most trusted lieutenant, had noticed it. 2. "They're scared, Cat," Tony said one evening during a quiet meeting in the basement of a closed bar. "The young ones think you're losing grip. They see the feds circling. They're talking about new bosses, new crews." Fat Cat leaned back in his chair, exhaling smoke toward the dim light overhead. "Talking's free," he said. "Action's expensive. Let's see who's willing to pay." That line, like everything Fat Cat said, carried double meaning. It was both a warning and a promise. He knew that to keep control, he'd have to remind everyone why his name still mattered. And in his world, reminders often came in blood. The next week, one of his mid-level distributors, a man named Dre who'd grown too bold, went missing. Dre had been skimming product, moving his own side deals on Fat Cat's turf. It was the kind of disrespect that would have once been unthinkable. When his body turned up 3 days later in a dumpster behind a warehouse, the message was unmistakable. For a brief moment, order returned. The streets went quiet. No one questioned Fat Cat's authority. But the victory was hollow. Each act of control now came with consequences. Each punishment drew more attention from the DEA. The tighter he tried to grip his empire, the faster it seemed to slip through his fingers. Meanwhile, the investigation against him had evolved. What had started as local surveillance was now a joint federal task force involving the DEA, FBI, and Baltimore police. They had wiretaps on phones, undercover agents posing as low-level buyers, and, most dangerous of all, informants embedded within his circle. Fat Cat didn't know who was feeding them information. He just knew someone was. And that uncertainty was eating him alive. He stopped trusting everyone, even Tony. Meetings that used to last hours now ended in minutes. He spoke less, observed more. His paranoia became his shadow, following him into every room, every car ride, every silence. There were nights when he would drive the length of the city in silence, headlights dimmed, watching the streets he once owned, the same corners, the same rowhouses, the same people. But it all looked different now. The empire he'd built with precision had turned chaotic, unpredictable. He felt like a man haunting his own kingdom, a ghost walking through the ruins of his own making. Then came the night that changed everything. One of his oldest stash houses, a row home in West Baltimore, nondescript and quiet, was raided. It wasn't the first raid, but it was the most precise. The feds knew exactly where to go, exactly what to take, exactly who would be inside. It wasn't luck. It was information. Someone close had talked. Fat Cat got the call just after midnight. He was in a safe house across town, sitting alone with a drink in his hand, the TV flickering silently in front of him. When he heard the words, "They hit the house," he didn't speak for nearly a full minute. Just stared at the wall, jaw clenched, breathing slow. Finally, he said, "Who told them?" No one had an answer. And that silence was worse than any confession. He called Tony. "Pull everyone in," he said flatly. "No more deliveries, no more shipments. Everything stops till I say otherwise." It was the first time he'd ever halted operations completely. The empire froze overnight. Streets that had moved product daily went silent. The sudden stillness rippled through Baltimore's underworld like a chill wind. To outsiders, it looked like control. To insiders, it looked like fear. For the next few days, Fat Cat interrogated his closest men. Calmly, methodically, almost gently. He wanted to look into their eyes, to see if the truth would show itself. It didn't. Everyone swore loyalty. Everyone denied betrayal. But he could feel the lie somewhere in the room. It was in the nervous laughter, the fidgeting hands, the glances that didn't last long enough. Tony tried to talk him down. "You can't start eating your own, Cat. That's what they want. To turn us against each other." But Fat Cat wasn't listening anymore. His paranoia had evolved into obsession. He began shadowing his own men, using independent watchers to track their movements. He rotated his safe houses daily, used new phones every week. Even his old friends started to feel like strangers. The stress began to show in small ways. His once impeccable suits were now wrinkled. He smoked constantly, his hands trembling just slightly when he lit his lighter. He slept less, spoke less, trusted less. And then, another hit, a second raid, this time in New York, targeting one of his distribution partners. The feds had connected the Baltimore network to a larger interstate trafficking ring. Fat Cat's name appeared in documents seized during the raid. It wasn't direct evidence, but it was enough to raise alarms. He could feel the circle tightening. Every time he looked out a window, he expected to see flashing lights. Every time he heard footsteps behind him, his hand twitched toward his gun. Still, he refused to run. "You don't run from your own name," he told Tony. "You protect it, even if it kills you." And perhaps, deep down, he already knew that was how it would end. By now, the DEA had enough to justify a warrant. But they waited, gathering, listening, learning. Fat Cat's empire was too big to take down halfway. They wanted it all, the money, the suppliers, the lieutenants, the king himself. Meanwhile, Fat Cat's world was shrinking. The calls grew fewer. The money slowed. The loyalty that once defined his empire had curdled into fear. He could feel it, not in words, but in energy. A man who once commanded silence now found himself surrounded by it, suffocated by it. And yet, despite the fear, despite the walls closing in, he never broke composure. To the very end, he carried himself like a man in control. His eyes still sharp, his voice still low and measured. But beneath that calm exterior, one truth echoed louder each day: the end was no longer coming. It was already here. The winter of 1987 descended on Baltimore with a bitter chill, and for Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Nichols, it felt like the cold had seeped into his bones. The once vibrant rhythm of his empire, the constant flow of money, the coded phone calls, the hum of late-night meetings, had slowed to an uneasy silence. The streets that once sang his name now whispered it in caution. Something had shifted in the air, and even Fat Cat, a man who prided himself on composure, could feel it pressing against his chest like invisible weight. By now, his world had become a maze of shadows and second guesses. He no longer trusted his lieutenants to meet in the same place twice. Every conversation was layered in code. Every delivery was rerouted, double-checked, and filtered through layers of intermediaries. His empire, once a model of efficiency, was now a labyrinth of caution, a survival mechanism built from fear. He had always believed control was the key to longevity, but now he was learning that control had its limits. The DEA task force was moving like ghosts, unseen but ever present. They were patient, methodical, and watching everything. His phone lines were tapped. His stash houses were under surveillance. His soldiers, whether they knew it or not, were being tracked through every move, every call, every careless word. One evening, Fat Cat sat alone in a small apartment overlooking a darkened street. The room smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old furniture. On the table in front of him lay a half-empty glass of whiskey and a folded stack of photographs, grainy surveillance shots showing cars, faces, and license plates. Someone had been following him. He wasn't sure who anymore, the feds, his rivals, or his own paranoia. He stared at the photos for a long time before finally saying aloud, "They already in the walls." His voice was calm, almost resigned. Tony Rivers entered quietly, a heavy coat still dripping with melted snow. "We can move you, Cat. I got a spot up north, out of the city. Lay low till we figure this out." Fat Cat shook his head slowly. "You run when you guilty." "I ain't guilty. Not yet." Tony sat across from him, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "You know they're closing in. It ain't like before. They ain't coming for your corners, they're coming for you." Fat Cat looked up, eyes steady. "Then I'll be ready." That was the thing about Fat Cat, even when cornered, he never showed panic. He'd built his life on projecting calm authority, and he wasn't about to abandon it now. But inside, the unease was growing. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it came in fragments. Dreams of old times, of laughter, of youth, of the first days when the streets still felt like opportunity instead of prison. He'd wake up sweating, pulse racing, reaching for a gun that was always within arm's reach. He'd grown accustomed to the hum of danger, but lately, that hum had turned into a constant ringing in his ears, a signal that something was about to break. The turning point came one icy night in January. A small stash house on the east side, one of the few he thought still safe, was raided. The DEA seized nearly 2 kilos of heroin and arrested 2 of his mid-level runners. One of them, under pressure, named names. It wasn't a full confession, but it was enough to connect the dots. Enough for the feds to start building their case around Fat Cat directly. When Tony broke the news, Fat Cat didn't flinch. He just took a slow sip from his glass, eyes distant. "They always find a weak link," he murmured. "Always." He leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Start cutting ties. Burn everything that connects back to me. Phones, ledgers, safe houses, all of it." For the next 48 hours, the operation went dark. Trucks were moved, stash points abandoned, contacts erased. Fat Cat had spent decades building his empire, and now, in less than 2 days, he began dismantling it piece by piece. It was like watching a man destroy his own monument before the world could claim it. But it wasn't enough. Within weeks, the DEA launched coordinated raids across Baltimore and New York. Over a dozen arrests were made, each one pulling another thread in the web. Fat Cat's name surfaced in nearly every debriefing. The agents now had wiretap evidence, financial records, and, most importantly, testimonies from people who had once sworn they'd never speak. Inside his safe house, Fat Cat listened to the reports as if they were weather updates, calm, analytical, detached. "They think they know the whole story," he said quietly to Tony. "But they only know the noise. The real story's still in here." He tapped his chest with one finger. Tony didn't respond. He was watching his old friend fade, not physically, but spiritually. The man who once commanded entire networks with a single word now looked like a tired king guarding a crumbling throne. Still, there were moments of the old fire. When news came that one of his lieutenants, Reggie, had flipped in exchange for witness protection, Fat Cat's calm cracked for the first time. He slammed his glass against the wall, shattering it. "Reggie? Reggie? That boy I fed, clothed, kept out the gutter, he gave me up." Tony said nothing. He knew that kind of betrayal was the deepest wound a man like Fat Cat could suffer. The next day, Reggie's cousin disappeared. No one said how. No one needed to. It was Fat Cat's last show of power, a final reminder that even cornered, he still had reach. But deep down, he knew it was futile. The streets no longer feared him the same way. The younger dealers didn't see him as a legend anymore, they saw him as history, a cautionary tale still in progress. One cold February morning, Fat Cat stood at his window, watching snow fall over the city. His breath fogged the glass as he whispered, "This city used to move when I spoke." He turned to Tony, who stood behind him, silent. "Now it moves without me." Tony sighed. "Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be, Cat." Fat Cat smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both acceptance and exhaustion. "Ain't no supposed to be in this life, Tony. We make the rules. Then we die by 'em." That night, he packed a small bag, cash, a few clothes, a pistol. He didn't say where he was going, only that he needed to clear his head. Tony offered to come along, but Fat Cat refused. "Too many ghosts already riding with me," he said quietly. He left before dawn, driving through empty streets dusted with snow. The city looked different in the pale light, softer, almost peaceful. He knew this peace was temporary, an illusion before the storm. But for that brief drive, he let himself believe in it. What he didn't know was that, while he drove through the sleeping city, federal agents were finalizing the paperwork that would bring his empire, and his freedom, to an end. The warrants were signed. The evidence was ready. The storm he'd been sensing for months was now officially on its way. He wasn't running from the law that morning. He was driving straight toward it. The mid-1980s marked the true golden era of Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman, a time when his empire didn't just grow, it dominated. By now, Coleman was more than a street hustler, he was a brand, a myth whispered through every corner of Baltimore. His operation was so structured, so disciplined, that even the law had difficulty tracing his footprints. Fat Cat had evolved into something larger than life, a businessman cloaked in street reputation, a criminal mastermind who ran his empire with a calm, methodical precision that made him appear untouchable. His network was vast. Heroin flowed through his organization like blood through veins, reaching from Baltimore's low-income housing projects to upscale neighborhoods. Every bag carried his silent signature, purity, consistency, and quality. To addicts, it was gold. To his men, it was loyalty. To the police, it was a ghost trail that never seemed to end. The money rolled in faster than anyone could count it, and Fat Cat, always one step ahead, diversified his operations. He invested in local businesses, purchased nightclubs, and even fronted legitimate ventures to launder his cash. What made Coleman different was his ability to stay invisible. While other drug lords paraded their wealth, Fat Cat moved with quiet dignity. He preferred whispers to roars, shadows to spotlights. He rarely attended public events, and when he did, it was in a tailored suit that reflected quiet authority rather than flamboyance. His men knew the rules: discipline, silence, and respect. Breaking those rules meant exile, or worse. To them, he wasn't just a boss, he was a father figure, one who demanded excellence and gave protection in return. But beneath the calm exterior was a man who carried deep paranoia. Coleman knew power came with a ticking clock. He'd seen others rise and fall, kingpins who thought they were invincible until the streets swallowed them whole. The paranoia made him sharper. He changed stash houses weekly, used coded messages, and rotated his lieutenants' duties. Each decision was calculated to keep his empire stable and his enemies guessing. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about lasting. The Baltimore Police Department, however, had started to take notice. Detectives began noticing patterns: the same corners flooded with the same brand of heroin, the same luxury cars appearing in impoverished neighborhoods, the same faces resurfacing after major busts. A task force was quietly assembled, and the name, Fat Cat, began appearing in reports. But Coleman's structure made infiltration nearly impossible. Everyone beneath him knew only their small part of the puzzle, and no one dared to betray him. Inside the underworld, Coleman's legend grew. He was known as the gentleman dealer. Unlike many street-level dealers who ruled with chaos, Fat Cat ruled with intellect. His meetings were calm, his voice soft, his punishments measured but final. He saw his empire as a business, his men as employees, and the streets as his market. Those who crossed him didn't meet a loud, angry gangster, they met a silent storm. In this era, Coleman began mentoring young dealers, teaching them the unspoken code of the trade: loyalty, order, and foresight. He preached patience, urging them not to draw unnecessary attention. He believed in longevity over greed, a rare philosophy in a world where most burned out quickly. This fatherly influence made him a legend in Baltimore's criminal ecosystem. Many saw him not as a villain, but as a necessary force, someone who brought order to chaos. Still, there were cracks beginning to show beneath the surface. The influx of cash drew envy. Rival factions whispered about taking over his corners, while some of his lieutenants grew ambitious. Coleman noticed the subtle changes: eyes that lingered too long, words that carried hidden tones. Trust became a fragile thing. He began limiting meetings, relying only on a tight inner circle. Even among his own men, he was an enigma, respected, feared, but increasingly distant. And as the empire expanded, so did the stakes. The purity of his heroin drew attention beyond Baltimore, to the DEA and to rival organizations in neighboring states. Coleman's operations began to brush against territories claimed by other major distributors. A quiet tension started brewing in the shadows. Fat Cat knew the rules of the underworld: expansion often meant exposure, and exposure invited enemies. But to him, retreat was never an option. As he stood in his quiet office above one of his front businesses, overlooking the streets he controlled, Coleman understood that power was a delicate balance. He had everything: wealth, loyalty, influence, but the cost was constant vigilance. Every car that slowed near his home, every unfamiliar face in a crowd, every whispered rumor had to be analyzed. The life he built had turned into a chess game where one wrong move meant checkmate. And yet, in those moments of solitude, Fat Cat didn't see himself as a criminal. In his own mind, he was a man who took what the world denied him: respect, opportunity, control. He didn't see the destruction behind his empire, he saw survival. He saw himself as a product of the same system that forced him to build power from the streets. It was this belief that gave him peace, and perhaps, made his fall all the more tragic. In this golden era, Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman was untouchable, a silent monarch of Baltimore's heroin world. But like all empires built in the shadows, his was destined to face the light. The question wasn't if it would fall. The question was how, and who would light the fuse. The walls were beginning to close in. By the late 1980s, Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman's empire, once a silent symphony of precision and power, was now echoing with faint cracks of betrayal and fear. The streets that once whispered his name in reverence had started to hum with a different tone, one of curiosity, suspicion, and restlessness. Power had a weight, and Coleman could feel it pressing heavier than ever before. His empire had become so vast, so layered, that even he began to lose sight of its edges. And in the dark corners of Baltimore, those who once swore loyalty began quietly asking themselves dangerous questions: how long could the king of heroin truly reign? Coleman's inner circle, once disciplined and unwavering, was starting to fracture. Paranoia became the unspoken language of the crew. Meetings that once lasted hours were reduced to minutes, coded words replaced open conversations. Coleman's rules, silence, loyalty, control, were being tested by the hunger of those beneath him. The money had become intoxicating, the power addicting. Some of his lieutenants began believing they could run corners better than he could. Others started stealing small portions from the supply, thinking he wouldn't notice. But Fat Cat noticed everything. He had grown colder, more distant. The warm, fatherly tone that once drew men close had been replaced by an eerie calm that made them uneasy. He spoke less and watched more. His eyes scanned every gesture, every tone of voice, every pause in conversation. Coleman knew the streets had no mercy for men who grew comfortable. Every empire fell, he had seen it too many times. And now, he could feel the winds shifting toward him. It was around this time that law enforcement began tightening the net. The Baltimore police had been quietly building a case for years, piecing together the puzzle of Coleman's operation. Surveillance teams followed his runners, tapped phones, and tracked financial movements. The DEA got involved too, bringing federal attention to his network. They called it Operation Golden Web, a joint effort to map out the veins of heroin distribution that seemed to flow back to one man, Fat Cat Coleman. But Coleman was always one step ahead. He rotated stash houses every few days, used decoy drivers, and had informants inside law enforcement feeding him bits of intelligence. For every move they made, he countered with 3. The cat-and-mouse game intensified, each side growing more cautious and cunning. Coleman's organization had weathered smaller storms before, but this one felt different. This was not a local turf war, it was the weight of the federal government pressing down on his world. The pressure seeped into his personal life. Coleman's long-term girlfriend, Marcia, began noticing the change in him. Nights once filled with laughter were now silent. He'd sit alone in his dimly lit living room, cigarette smoke curling around him, staring into nothing. The man who once commanded entire blocks with his presence now seemed haunted by something unseen. "You can't fight the whole world, Lorenzo," she told him once. He didn't answer, he simply exhaled and said, "You'd be surprised what I've survived." Coleman's paranoia grew alongside his isolation. He began suspecting everyone, even his closest men. One of his lieutenants, Terrence Lil T. Green, had been acting strange, missing meetings, delaying payments, avoiding eye contact. Rumors swirled that he'd been picked up by the police and quietly flipped. Coleman couldn't take chances. Late one night, Lil T was found dead in his car on the east side, execution style. Word spread fast. Everyone knew what it meant: Fat Cat still ruled with an iron hand, and betrayal would not be tolerated. But the damage was already done. Lil T's death didn't restore order, it deepened the fractures. Fear crept through the ranks. Some fled the city. Others began talking to authorities, desperate to save themselves from Coleman's wrath or the inevitable collapse of his empire. Every whisper, every rumor became another thread pulled from the fabric of his organization. And slowly, that fabric began to unravel. Outside, Baltimore itself was changing. The crack epidemic was rising, shifting the city's criminal landscape. New players emerged, young, reckless, and fearless. They didn't respect the old codes that Coleman had lived by. They didn't see him as a mentor, but as an aging relic from a different era. These new dealers didn't operate with quiet strategy, they made noise, they drew attention, and in doing so, they brought more heat onto everyone, including Fat Cat's operation. Coleman tried to adapt. He expanded his network, experimented with new products, and attempted to align himself with these younger crews. But their chaos clashed with his discipline. Where he saw a business, they saw a playground. The streets were changing faster than he could control them. And for a man who had built his empire on control, losing it was like drowning slowly. Meanwhile, law enforcement grew bolder. Raids began hitting closer to home, warehouses, stash houses, and even legitimate businesses tied to Coleman. Still, no one could pin him directly. He was the ghost in the system, the name behind the curtain. Every detective working the case knew who he was, but proving it in court was another matter entirely. His legend only grew because of it. To the public, he was a phantom king. To the police, he was an obsession. To his men, he was both savior and curse. Late one night, as he sat in his car overlooking the dim lights of Baltimore's west side, Coleman thought about the early days, the ambition, the loyalty, the sense of purpose. Now, it all felt hollow. The money didn't bring peace, only more danger. The loyalty had turned to suspicion. The control he once had was slipping like sand through his fingers. He was surrounded by wealth but consumed by solitude. He thought of leaving, disappearing to Florida or even overseas. He had the money, the connections. But deep down, he knew he couldn't walk away. The streets were in his blood. They had built him, defined him, and now they were devouring him. There was no clean exit from a world that ran on shadows. In those quiet, sleepless nights, Fat Cat realized something few men in his position ever did. It wasn't the police or the rivals that destroyed empires, it was the erosion within. Trust, loyalty, peace, all of it eventually rotted from the inside out. And as he sat in that car, the city lights flickering like dying stars, he felt the first true tremor of his downfall. By the dawn of the 1990s, Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman's empire was standing on a fragile edge, still vast, still profitable, but quietly bleeding from within. The man who once moved through the streets like an untouchable shadow now lived in constant fear of the ghosts he had created. His paranoia had evolved into a full-time occupation. Every phone call, every unexpected knock on the door, every unfamiliar car parked near his block sent a chill down his spine. He could feel the law tightening its grip, not fast, but steady, methodical, inevitable. The empire that once seemed immortal was now decaying from its core. His lieutenants were thinning out, some dead, some imprisoned, others simply gone without a trace. Even his most trusted associates had grown quiet. There was a tension in every meeting, a weight in every word. Coleman began holding fewer gatherings, speaking only to 2 or 3 men he still trusted. But even they noticed it, the fatigue in his eyes, the quiet trembling in his voice, the restless tapping of his fingers against the table as he spoke. He was tired, though he'd never admit it. The city itself had turned hostile. Baltimore was changing, and not in ways Coleman could predict. New gangs with younger, bolder leaders had begun taking over corners that once belonged to him. They weren't built on discipline or order, they thrived on chaos. Crack cocaine was now the ruling drug of the streets, and its economics were faster, louder, and far deadlier. Coleman's brand of business, organized, careful, deliberate, was being replaced by reckless ambition. And worse, these new players didn't fear him. They didn't remember the days when Fat Cat's name meant silence. But law enforcement remembered. They had never stopped watching. The DEA's Operation Golden Web was nearing its final phase. Over the years, they had flipped small-time dealers, traced financial trails, and collected testimonies. Slowly, piece by piece, they were mapping the invisible skeleton of Coleman's empire. Still, what they lacked was the final link, something that directly tied the man himself to the shipments. And then, one night, their break came. A mid-level distributor named Anthony "Tone" Barrett was arrested with several kilos of heroin during a sting operation. He was terrified, not of prison, but of what would happen if Fat Cat found out he'd been caught. Detectives played on that fear, feeding him promises of protection and reduced time. At first, Barrett refused to talk, but after a week of isolation and subtle threats, he cracked. He told them everything, the drop points, the coded language, even how Coleman used legitimate businesses as fronts. It wasn't enough to arrest Fat Cat, but it was enough to open doors. Word of Barrett's betrayal spread like wildfire. Coleman's men were furious, some demanding vengeance. But Fat Cat didn't react immediately. He sat in silence when he heard the news, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said quietly, "When a man starts talking to the police, he's already dead. Whether I pull the trigger or the streets do, it's the same ending." His calmness was more terrifying than rage. Within a week, Barrett disappeared. His body was found months later in an abandoned warehouse, unrecognizable but unmistakably marked with the precision of Coleman's message, "No one betrays the family." That incident sent shockwaves through the streets. Loyalty returned, but only out of fear. Coleman's organization was now operating on survival mode, no longer expanding, no longer innovating, just surviving day to day. The money still flowed, but the joy was gone. Even his closest allies felt the suffocating pressure. They lived knowing that one wrong move, one careless word, could be their last. Amid this chaos, Coleman's mother passed away. It hit him harder than anyone expected. For years, he had shielded her from his world, sending money, buying her a house, pretending to be a businessman. Her death stripped away that illusion. At her funeral, surrounded by distant relatives and a few loyal men, Coleman stood in silence as the priest spoke. For the first time in a long while, he looked small, almost human. After the burial, he lingered alone by her grave long after everyone left. A single line escaped his lips, quiet but heavy, "You raised a son who built a kingdom of ghosts." That night, something changed in him. He became more withdrawn, more reflective. He spent long hours alone in his home, reading old letters, staring at photographs. The empire had given him everything, power, wealth, respect, but it had also taken everything that truly mattered. The streets had replaced love with loyalty, and loyalty with fear. It was a trade he could no longer justify, yet too late to reverse. Meanwhile, the DEA's investigation accelerated. The agents now had enough to pursue a warrant. Financial records linked multiple shell companies to Coleman. Wiretaps caught conversations between his lieutenants, coded but decipherable. And confidential informants, men who once stood beside him, began turning one by one. The noose was tightening, and everyone could feel it. Coleman's lawyers advised him to lay low, maybe even leave the city for a while. But he refused. "Baltimore is my home," he said softly. "If it's going to end, it ends here." He began sleeping less. Nights were filled with cigarette smoke and restless pacing. The same city lights that once symbolized triumph now seemed like silent judges staring down on him. He no longer trusted his phones, his crew, or even his own reflection. Every sound outside felt like a knock. Every day felt like a countdown. In his final weeks of freedom, Coleman tried to stabilize what was left of his empire. He distributed money among his family, made calls to settle debts, and instructed his lieutenants to destroy evidence. He was preparing, though he couldn't admit what for. Somewhere deep down, he knew, the storm was coming, and this time, there would be no shelter. The final sign came one early morning. Coleman received a call from one of his contacts inside the precinct. "They're coming for you," the man said. "Federal warrant. They've got everything they need." Coleman didn't panic. He simply hung up the phone, poured himself a drink, and looked out the window at the quiet city he had ruled for nearly 2 decades. "It was a good run," he whispered. As the first light of dawn broke, unmarked cars began surrounding his neighborhood. Doors slammed, radios crackled, and a voice shouted through a bullhorn, "Lorenzo Coleman. Federal agents. Step outside." Inside, Fat Cat finished his drink, straightened his shirt, and muttered, "Let's get this over with." He walked out calmly, his hands raised, his face unreadable. The empire of shadows had finally met the morning light. The morning of Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman's arrest was strangely quiet, no gunfire, no chase, no cinematic showdown. Just a calm surrender. For a man who had built his entire life on controlling chaos, the silence was almost poetic. The agents moved in swiftly, their faces expressionless, their voices measured. They placed the cuffs around his wrists with the precision of men who had been waiting for this moment for years. Coleman didn't resist. He didn't shout or plead. He simply looked each of them in the eye, one by one, as if silently acknowledging that the game was over. Inside the federal vehicle, as the city he once ruled disappeared in the rearview mirror, Coleman felt an unfamiliar calm. It wasn't peace, it was the numb acceptance of inevitability. For years, he had known this day would come. Every move he made, every dollar he earned, had been a gamble against time. Now, time had finally called his bluff. He sat back, his eyes fixed on the skyline, thinking of the long road that brought him here, the corners, the deals, the betrayals, the endless cycle of power and paranoia. He had built an empire from dust, but even dust eventually returns to the wind. At the station, chaos returned in the form of flashing cameras and echoing questions. Reporters shouted his name as agents led him inside. "Fat Cat. How long have you been running the heroin trade? Did you kill Anthony Barrett? Do you have ties to the New York mob?" Coleman kept his head down. The cameras flashed like lightning, freezing him in moments that would fill the front pages by morning. He was no longer the ghost of Baltimore's streets, he was now the face of its corruption. His booking felt surreal. Fingerprints, photographs, inventory of possessions, every step reducing a king to a number in a system he once thought he'd never enter. The agents seemed almost respectful. Some of them had studied his file for years, quietly fascinated by how methodical and disciplined he had been. One even whispered, "You could have run a Fortune 500 company." Coleman smirked faintly and replied, "I did. Just not the kind you print on business cards." The interrogation came next. 2 federal agents, one young and eager, the other older, calm, and precise, sat across from him in a dimly lit room. A tape recorder clicked on. The older agent began, "Lorenzo Coleman, we've been following you for a long time. You've built one of the most efficient drug networks in Maryland's history. We have your lieutenants, your suppliers, your shell companies. But we want you." Coleman leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and said, "You already got me. The rest is just paperwork." They pressed him for hours, names, connections, routes. He gave them nothing. He knew the rules of the game hadn't changed. Talking was death, whether in the streets or behind bars. He answered only in vague riddles, careful not to reveal more than necessary. At times, he even toyed with them, responding with quiet sarcasm. "You boys ever stop to wonder why it took you this long to find me?" he said once, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't arrogance, it was a man clinging to the last fragments of control he had left. Back in the streets, the news of his arrest spread like wildfire. Every corner, every barbershop, every project hallway buzzed with disbelief. Some cheered, rivals who had long prayed for his downfall. Others mourned, remembering the man who had once fed families, settled disputes, and ruled with a strange kind of order. To many in Baltimore, Fat Cat was more than a criminal, he was a symbol of power in a city that offered little hope. His capture left a vacuum that no one was ready to fill. Inside the detention center, Coleman adapted quickly. He was quiet, observant, and oddly composed. Other inmates recognized him immediately, giving him a mix of respect and distance. In a place where most men clung to false bravado, Coleman carried himself with quiet authority. He didn't speak much, but when he did, others listened. He'd spend hours reading philosophy, history, even business management. It was as if he was trying to understand the world from a different angle, searching for meaning in the ruins of his empire. His lawyers worked tirelessly, but the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses had turned, financial trails had been mapped, and the government had built a case too strong to break. The charges were extensive: conspiracy, trafficking, money laundering, and murder-related offenses. Coleman faced the possibility of life behind bars. When his attorney broke the news, he nodded slowly and said, "Life is what you make it. I've lived mine twice already." The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with journalists, detectives, and spectators who wanted to witness the fall of the man they had once feared. Coleman sat silently throughout, dressed in a simple suit, his expression calm and unreadable. The prosecution painted him as a ruthless kingpin who poisoned his community for profit. The defense countered with the narrative of a man shaped by circumstance, a product of poverty and neglect who built an empire to survive in a system stacked against him. Testimonies from former associates filled the courtroom with tension. Men who had once sworn loyalty now pointed fingers, their voices trembling under oath. Coleman listened without flinching, though inside, he felt the weight of betrayal like knives twisting deeper with every word. He had always known the streets had no real friends, but seeing his former brothers testify against him solidified a truth he had long tried to ignore: in the end, everyone looks out for themselves. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on multiple counts, the room erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and a few spectators gasped. Coleman remained still, his gaze fixed ahead. There was no outburst, no breakdown. Just a quiet nod, as if acknowledging the end of a chapter that had already been written long before. The judge sentenced him to life in federal prison, citing him as one of the most disciplined yet destructive criminal minds Baltimore has ever seen. As he was led out of the courtroom, someone shouted, "Was it worth it, Fat Cat?" He paused for a moment, turned his head slightly, and said, "Everything costs something." It was the last public statement he ever made. That night, alone in his cell, Coleman lay awake listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint echoes of distant voices. He thought about the irony of it all, how he had spent his life chasing control, only to end up in a place where he had none. Yet deep down, there was a strange peace in the stillness. The chase was over. The empire, the power, the fear, all of it had finally stopped. And in that quiet, he realized something he never could on the streets: sometimes, freedom isn't about movement. It's about stillness. The cell was small, barely wide enough for the cot, a metal toilet, and a narrow slit of a window that let in thin blades of light. Yet for Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman, it felt almost serene. After years of paranoia, sleepless nights, and the unending tension of power, prison offered him something he hadn't known in decades: predictability. No more gunshots outside his window, no more betrayals to anticipate, no more raids to evade. Just the rhythm of locked doors, the clanging of keys, and the low hum of other inmates murmuring through concrete walls. For the first time since his youth, Coleman could finally breathe, even if it was behind bars. He quickly adapted to prison life, much like he adapted to the streets years ago. Fat Cat was never a man of panic, he was a man of observation. He studied the routines, the guards, the hierarchy among inmates. Within weeks, he understood who truly ran the facility, and it wasn't the men in uniform. He saw patterns, alliances, and quiet deals happening in corners of the yard. To most, prison was confinement. To Coleman, it was just another system, another network to understand, another code to master. His reputation preceded him. Even the most hardened inmates knew his name. To them, he wasn't just another convict, he was a legend, a story whispered through generations of hustlers. Younger inmates would approach him cautiously, curious but respectful. "You really ran all of East Baltimore?" one asked once, eyes wide. Coleman smirked faintly and said, "I ran what they let me run. Nobody really runs anything forever." That sentence stuck with them. His calmness, his measured speech, it carried authority that no violence could replicate. Over time, Coleman began mentoring the younger prisoners, not in the ways of crime, but in the ways of discipline. He'd sit in the yard during recreation hours, surrounded by small groups of inmates listening quietly as he spoke about control, patience, and consequences. "The streets don't owe you anything," he'd say softly. "You take what you can, but you pay for every piece you take. One way or another." It was strange, almost poetic. A man who once fed poison to his city now trying to feed wisdom to those who reminded him of his younger self. He started reading more, biographies, philosophy, psychology. He found solace in the words of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor who once wrote about the fleeting nature of power. Coleman saw reflections of himself in those pages, a man who once commanded legions but was still a prisoner of fate. "The things you think control you," he once wrote in a letter to a fellow inmate, "only have power because you fear losing them. Once you stop fearing, you're free, even in chains." Outside the prison walls, his name faded from headlines. The next generation of dealers replaced him, their faces splashed across newspapers and television screens. The streets moved on, as they always did. His empire dissolved completely, seized assets, flipped properties, arrested associates. The businesses that once laundered his money were now abandoned shells or under new management. The kingdom he built had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but stories. But in those stories, his legend grew even more. Fat Cat became a ghost, a myth of control and caution, a symbol of the old way that no longer existed. Inside, Coleman became something else, not a gangster, not a kingpin, but a philosopher of failure. He spent hours writing, filling notebooks with reflections on loyalty, greed, and mortality. He wrote about the illusion of respect, how men chase it all their lives without realizing it can't be owned, only borrowed. "The streets give you respect when they fear you," he wrote once, "but fear fades faster than love, and love is something they never had for men like us." Inmates began referring to him as "Old Man Cat." Even the guards treated him differently, not as a threat, but as a quiet relic of another era. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't pick sides. He simply existed with a calm grace that made even the harshest environment seem tolerable. Some guards would even stop by his cell just to talk. One, a younger officer named Davis, often asked him questions about life outside. "You ever regret it?" Davis once asked. Coleman took a long pause before answering. "Regret?" He smiled faintly. "No. Reflection, yes. Regret don't change nothing. Reflection helps you understand why you did it." Letters began arriving from the outside, from people he had never met. Young men from Baltimore, some still in the game, others trying to escape it, wrote to him asking for advice. They saw him as a mentor figure, someone who understood the system from within. Coleman replied to some of them, offering simple, thoughtful words: "Money can buy silence but not peace. Don't chase what doesn't sleep." His letters became quiet gospel among those still navigating the streets he once ruled. In those years, Coleman also began to face his mortality. Prison food, poor air, and age caught up with him. His hair grayed completely, and his once powerful frame grew leaner. Still, his eyes, those calm, calculating eyes, remained the same. There was no bitterness in him, only a quiet acceptance. He spent hours sitting by the small window in his cell, watching the sky shift colors. "Same sky as Baltimore," he'd whisper to himself. It reminded him that even though his empire had vanished, the world went on, indifferent and infinite. Sometimes, at night, he would dream of the past, the street corners lit by flickering lamps, the sound of cars, the smell of rain on cracked pavement. In his dreams, he wasn't running, wasn't hiding. He was just walking, free, unseen, at peace. And every time he woke, the silence of his cell felt a little softer. He found small joys in routine. Morning coffee, a good book, a quiet conversation in the yard. To outsiders, these might have seemed insignificant, but to a man who had lived in constant motion, they were everything. In those small moments, he discovered a kind of freedom that the streets never offered, the freedom from wanting. In his 12th year of incarceration, Coleman was transferred to a lower security facility due to good behavior and declining health. There, he lived a quieter existence. He worked in the library, helping other inmates learn to read, sometimes guiding them through the same books that once changed him. His wisdom had turned into something genuine, not power-seeking, not manipulative, just human. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the razor-wire fences, Coleman sat by the window, writing his final entry in a worn notebook. The words were simple, deliberate: "I chased control my whole life, but peace came when I stopped chasing. The world outside is loud, but silence teaches you everything." He closed the notebook, exhaled slowly, and leaned back on his cot. The hum of the prison filled the air, steady and familiar. In that moment, he wasn't Fat Cat, the kingpin of Baltimore. He wasn't a convict or a criminal. He was just a man finally at rest, surrounded by the quiet he had spent a lifetime running from. When the news of Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman's declining health began to circulate among those who remembered him, whispers moved quietly through Baltimore's old neighborhoods. For many, it was like hearing that a ghost was fading away, a man who had once defined the city's underworld now reduced to fragile bones and soft-spoken reflections. The young men who ran the corners no longer knew his face, but they knew his name, spoken in low tones as both a warning and a legend. To the old heads, he was the final echo of a time when the street still had rules, when power had structure, and when loyalty, though deadly, meant something real. Inside prison, Coleman had grown slower but not weaker in spirit. His body betrayed him, arthritis stiffened his hands, his breathing came shallow, and his eyesight dimmed, but his mind remained razor-sharp. Each morning he still rose before dawn, performing the same ritual. He'd sit by his narrow window, watch the sky lighten, and whisper a short prayer, not to any god in particular, but to the balance he'd spent his life seeking. There was serenity in those moments, a silence that reminded him of what freedom truly meant. He no longer dreamed of the streets or the money. What haunted him now were the faces, the people who had fallen because of him. Associates who'd taken bullets for his empire, mothers who'd buried sons because of his product, children who had grown up without fathers because of choices he made. Those memories followed him everywhere, like smoke that never lifted. "You don't just pay for what you do," he'd once told a fellow inmate, "you pay for what you cause." That understanding aged him more than time ever could. The letters kept coming, more than ever. Young hustlers, disillusioned soldiers of the street, and even college students studying criminology wrote to him. They wanted insight, not into how to build an empire, but how to escape one. Coleman responded to some of them with words that cut through illusion: "Power is a disease of the lonely. The more you feed it, the more it eats you." His handwriting had grown shakier, but his thoughts carried the same measured weight that had once silenced entire rooms. Despite his deteriorating condition, he continued working in the prison library. To him, that small space of shelves and dust was sacred ground. He found purpose in teaching younger inmates to read, guiding them through books that mirrored his own evolution: Malcolm X's autobiography, the teachings of Stoicism, even novels about redemption and loss. Many saw him as a mentor, some as a father figure. And though he rarely smiled, there was something peaceful in the way he moved, unhurried, deliberate, like a man who had finally stopped running. In quiet moments, he'd look back on his past not with pride or shame, but with a kind of detached acceptance. He saw it now as a story, one chapter leading into the next, each decision carrying its own inevitable consequence. You can't rewrite the past, he'd say, but you can learn its language. To him, every tragedy, every betrayal, every loss was a sentence in that language. He had spent decades learning to read it fluently. As months passed, his health declined further. He suffered from heart complications and recurring chest pain. The prison doctors did what they could, but time is a force no man escapes. Still, Coleman faced it with the same stoicism he had once reserved for war on the streets. He never complained, never showed fear. When an old friend from his neighborhood sent word through a mutual contact asking if he wanted to be remembered as a kingpin, he simply replied, "Remember me as a man who finally understood the cost." In his final year, Coleman was transferred again, this time to a medical correctional facility. The white walls and sterile air contrasted sharply with the grit of the Baltimore blocks he once owned. Nurses spoke gently to him, though most didn't know who he was. To them, he was just an old inmate with failing lungs and tired eyes. But in the letters that arrived weekly, he was still Fat Cat, the ghost of Baltimore's golden age of crime, the man whose empire had shaped generations. Sometimes, at night, he'd hear the faint sound of rain against the window and imagine it was falling on the row houses of his youth. In his mind, he walked those streets again, but this time, they were empty. No deals, no guns, no fear. Just silence. It was a silence that didn't punish him, but embraced him. It was forgiveness, though he never asked for it. He spent his last months writing what would become his final reflections, a small collection of notes and letters he called The Price of Power. In them, he detailed the psychological decay of men who chase control, the illusion of respect, and the emptiness that follows the fall. "The streets make you believe you matter," he wrote, "but when you're gone, they keep moving, like waves washing away names drawn in sand." One evening, as the sun set through the narrow hospital window, Coleman asked a nurse to bring him his notebook. With trembling hands, he wrote his last words, "I built walls to keep out fear, but those walls kept out peace too. In the end, all I ever wanted was quiet." He passed away 2 nights later, in his sleep, under the low hum of fluorescent lights. There were no headlines, no breaking news. Just a quiet note on the inmate bulletin board, "Lorenzo Coleman, deceased." But outside those walls, his legend lived on, in whispered stories told in barbershops, in old photographs traded among aging hustlers, in the lessons he left behind in ink and memory. To the city, he became more than a criminal, he was a mirror. A reflection of how power rises, how it corrupts, and how, in the end, even kings must kneel before time. And for those who truly understood his journey, his final lesson lingered, that redemption doesn't erase the past, it simply gives meaning to its weight. In the months following Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman's death, Baltimore moved on, or at least, it pretended to. The corners that once pulsed with his product were now ruled by younger crews, reckless and hungry for quick money. The city's rhythm had changed, more chaotic, less disciplined. The new generation of dealers didn't know the code Fat Cat had enforced, the order he'd demanded, or the quiet respect that once governed the streets. They dealt in loud cars, flashing cash, and social media fame, things that Fat Cat would have seen as suicidal arrogance. Yet even in this noisy era, his ghost lingered. His name carried a strange duality, both cursed and revered. Some saw him as the man who poisoned a generation, while others, especially those who had lived through the old days, spoke of him as a philosopher in the wrong world. His words, his lessons, his sense of balance between control and morality, they all lived on in fragments, whispered through generations of hustlers like scripture passed in shadow. After his death, a journalist from the Baltimore Sun began piecing together his story. She found fragments of his letters, interviews with former associates, and prison documents that painted a fuller picture of the man behind the myth. Her eventual feature, titled The King Who Knew Too Late, described Coleman as a man who ruled the streets but lost himself to the silence between victories. It was the first time his story was told not as sensational crime drama, but as human tragedy. The article went viral, not for its violence, but for its introspection. It made people ask, was Fat Cat a villain, or was he a reflection of a system that birthed him? Former associates began speaking out, cautiously, about their time under his command. One of his old lieutenants, now in his 60s, gave an interview in which he said, "People don't understand, he taught us structure. Without him, it was just chaos. He kept the city from eating itself alive." Another man described how Fat Cat once refused to let a young recruit join his ranks because the boy was still in school. "He told me, if he's got a chance to read his way out, don't let him die for the corner." That was the kind of man he was. These stories painted a more complex portrait. Coleman wasn't just a dealer, he was a man caught between survival and conscience. His empire was built on poison, yet his personal code seemed to seek balance, even redemption. The contradiction made him fascinating to scholars, criminologists, and filmmakers alike. Soon, documentaries began to surface, low budget at first, then more polished as interest grew. One major streaming service even produced a feature-length biopic called Fat Cat, The Quiet King of Baltimore. It depicted his rise and fall with surprising empathy, showing both the allure and the despair of his world. In the city, murals began appearing in alleyways, some depicting him with a crown, others with angel wings, and one haunting image showing him sitting at a chessboard, the pieces all tipped over except one. These weren't acts of glorification, but of remembrance. To those who painted them, Fat Cat represented something bigger, not heroism, but complexity. He symbolized a time when Baltimore's underworld had rules, when respect still meant something, and when the game had a certain tragic poetry to it. Community leaders, meanwhile, used his story as a teaching tool. In juvenile centers and outreach programs, his name became part of a cautionary tale, a way to show young people how easily intelligence could be swallowed by the street. Some mentors even read his prison letters aloud, using his words to reach those on the edge. He wasn't proud of what he did, one counselor said during a session. But he wanted you to understand why he did it. And that's what makes his story matter. But outside these circles, the myth began to blur. Online forums and street blogs debated whether Fat Cat was ever truly reformed, or if his late-life humility was just another survival tactic. Some doubted his authenticity, arguing that once a kingpin, always a kingpin. Yet those who met him during his final years disagreed. They spoke of a man who had finally learned peace, a man who found meaning in silence after decades of noise. The journalist who first wrote about him eventually published a full-length book, The Fat Cat Philosophy, blending biography with analysis of his letters and interviews. The book became an underground success, especially among readers interested in sociology and street psychology. One passage stood out and was widely quoted: Lorenzo Coleman didn't fall because of greed or betrayal. He fell because he searched for order in a world that fed on chaos. He wanted rules in a realm that had none. And when he realized that truth, it broke him. Years later, when the book was adapted into a documentary, Fat Cat's surviving family members, including a distant cousin and his sister, appeared briefly. His sister, an elderly woman with gentle eyes, spoke softly, he wasn't evil. He was lost. The streets raised him, but they never loved him back. Her voice cracked, and in that moment, the myth dissolved. What remained was a brother, a human being, flawed and brilliant, destroyed by the world he tried to master. Baltimore changed again in the years that followed, the crime evolved, the players rotated, but the essence remained. Still, older residents sometimes told the younger generation, "You think you're running something? You should have seen Fat Cat." That phrase became both a boast and a warning. It carried nostalgia, respect, and fear, all at once. Through memory and myth, Fat Cat became eternal. His story transcended crime, it became a reflection on human ambition, pride, and the endless search for redemption. Whether whispered on a corner or taught in a classroom, his legacy continued to breathe, not as a legend of the streets, but as a cautionary symphony of what power can give, and what it inevitably takes away. Because in the end, Fat Cat's true empire was not built of drugs or dollars, it was built of lessons. And those, unlike his kingdom, could never be seized. In the years after Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman's death, the echoes of his story began to ripple far beyond the city that had birthed him. What started as local legend evolved into something larger, a cultural ghost that haunted Baltimore's collective memory. His name appeared in rap lyrics, underground podcasts, sociology lectures, and even college dissertations examining the anatomy of urban power. Fat Cat had become both symbol and warning, the embodiment of how ambition could rise from the ashes of poverty and still be consumed by its own fire. The streets, however, never forget their architects. In corners where addicts still traded desperation for powder, old-timers would shake their heads and say, "This all started with Fat Cat." But their tone wasn't entirely condemning, it carried a strange, weary respect. They knew that in his time, Coleman had maintained a kind of grim order. There was hierarchy, structure, and even a twisted form of justice. After his empire collapsed, the game turned reckless, boys with guns and no codes, loyalty replaced by greed, mentorship replaced by fear. Baltimore, once ruled by quiet discipline, now vibrated with uncontrolled chaos. Yet in that chaos, something unexpected grew: introspection. Coleman's story forced the city to look inward. Community leaders began using his life as a lens to discuss systemic failure, poverty, and the illusion of escape through crime. Fat Cat wasn't born a kingpin, one former activist said during a radio interview. He was born into a system that gave him two options: survive or disappear. And he chose survival the only way he knew. That narrative sparked conversations that transcended judgment. It wasn't about glorifying him, it was about understanding the machinery that created him. His old letters, preserved by a small nonprofit dedicated to prison reform, were eventually compiled into an exhibit titled Echoes of the Cat. It featured his handwritten pages, faded photographs, and audio recordings of former associates reading his words aloud. The exhibit toured universities, drawing unexpected crowds. People came not for spectacle, but for silence, for the sobering realization that even those who ruled the underworld carried the same fears, regrets, and longings as anyone else. One letter, displayed under glass, read simply, "I thought control was power. But real power is peace. And I never found it until I had nothing left." Those words resonated deeply. Students stood in front of that display for long minutes, lost in thought. Professors referenced it in their lectures about moral psychology, urban sociology, and the philosophy of redemption. Slowly, Fat Cat's image shifted from villain to cautionary philosopher, a man whose downfall became a parable for modern society's obsession with dominance. Meanwhile, Baltimore's artistic community found inspiration in his duality. Painters, poets, and musicians used his life as metaphor: the rise of ego, the collapse of order, the yearning for redemption in a world that punishes reflection. A spoken-word artist from East Baltimore performed a haunting piece titled Crown of Smoke. They called him king, but his throne was made of ashes. They feared his silence, not his gun. And when the city forgot his name, his shadow still sat on every corner, waiting for someone to listen. The poem spread online, reigniting interest in Coleman's life story. Suddenly, new documentaries surfaced, not the sensationalized ones filled with gunfire and greed, but quiet retellings focused on the psychology of control and the fragility of redemption. One filmmaker described him as the ghost that teaches through regret. But the streets still whispered their own version. For every intellectual debate and art piece, there were still young hustlers who idolized Fat Cat for his intelligence and calm power. They admired the myth, the way he made millions without shouting, the way he turned fear into loyalty. What they often missed was the ending. They saw the empire, but not the emptiness. They repeated his name like a code, but ignored the silence that followed it. This divide, between myth and message, mirrored the city's soul. Baltimore had always been a place of contradictions, beauty and decay, ambition and despair, loyalty and betrayal. Fat Cat's life became the perfect metaphor for that tension. He was the city, proud, intelligent, wounded, and constantly at war with itself. His rise and fall were not isolated events, they were reflections of Baltimore's ongoing struggle to reconcile its past with its future. Years later, one of the men who had once worked under him returned to the same neighborhood where their empire had started. The buildings were crumbling, graffiti covered the old storefronts, and the streets felt different, colder, emptier. He stood at the corner where he once collected money for Fat Cat's operation, and whispered, "We thought we were building something permanent." A group of kids nearby played music from their phones, a rap song that mentioned Fat Cat's name. The man smiled sadly. "He's still here," he muttered, "just in a different way." The power of memory is strange. It transforms people into symbols, and symbols into lessons. Fat Cat had become one of those, a man whose shadow stretched beyond his lifetime, shaping conversations about morality, consequence, and the architecture of crime. His story now lived in classrooms, on murals, in music, not as glorification, but as a haunting reminder. In one of his last unpublished notes, found years later in a storage box from the prison, Coleman had written, "Maybe we all build kingdoms, some from bricks, others from mistakes. The trick isn't to rule them. It's to understand why we built them in the first place." That line became the closing quote of a major documentary about his life. As the narrator's voice faded and the screen turned black, it lingered like an echo, soft, reflective, eternal. Because even in death, Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman had one final role to play, not as a kingpin or a criminal, but as a mirror. A mirror that forced everyone who looked into it to ask themselves the hardest question of all, what are you building, and at what cost? Years behind bars had changed Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman in ways few could imagine. The once feared king of Baltimore's heroin empire had grown silent, reflective, almost monk-like. Gone were the gold chains and loud laughter. Now, his days revolved around books, meditation, and letters, not to his old crew, but to young men trapped in the same illusions he once chased. He began writing essays about greed, ego, and the illusions of power, compiling them into a series later titled Letters from the Shadows. Through simple, calm reflections, he admitted that he'd built an empire of pain. "The streets feed your hunger," he wrote, "but they never fill your soul." Over time, his prison writings gained attention. Community leaders quoted him in speeches. Teachers used his letters in schools. Fat Cat, the man who once poisoned his city, was now trying to heal it from within a concrete cage. He spoke during small inmate programs, not as a preacher but as a man stripped of lies. "Every empire," he'd say, "is built on borrowed time. What you take from others, time will take from you." Those words spread quietly, inspiring inmates to seek education, forgiveness, and self-awareness. By the time he reached his 60s, Coleman's influence had shifted entirely. He was no longer feared, he was respected, even by those who once hunted him. The empire was gone, but his wisdom endured. For the first time in his life, Lorenzo Coleman found what power could never buy, peace of mind. When Lorenzo, Fat Cat, Coleman died quietly in his sleep, the news passed through Baltimore like a sigh. No crowds, no chaos, only silence. Those who remembered him felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. At his small funeral, a pastor read from Coleman's own words, "The streets don't love you back, they only remember your footsteps." In the years that followed, his writings inspired the creation of a small foundation dedicated to helping at-risk youth, a poetic twist for a man who once ruled through fear. His face appeared on murals across the city, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of consequence. Lorenzo Coleman's empire had long vanished, but his reflections endured. In death, he found what he'd always searched for in life: peace, redemption, and the quiet forgiveness of time itself.